tord fluma, altras bladja, wisdom zolafthu in witten a floffa, and early a wham ed nissun to hit. Wesaþ, and welcome back to part 2 of this episode about the Anglo Saxon rune os. Now, in the first part of this episode, I spoke about the theophoric place names that indicate that there were certain places within England that were sacred to and dedicated to the god Woden. Whilst there is very little evidence left in written sources for the god Woden, there are plenty of places around the country, particularly in the southern part of England, that indicate that he was a very important god and that there were cults of Woden within England. So what I'd like to do in this episode is look at other evidence from Anglo Saxon literature and artifacts and see what we can find within those contexts to support the fact that Woden was an important deity to the Anglo Saxons. So I mentioned in the last episode about the Wofingers who built Sutton Hoo and how they considered themselves to be descendants of the god Woden. Now, basically, just about every royal house in England, every Anglo-Saxon royal house considered themselves to be the descendants of the god Woden, whereas in Sweden we tend to see the royal dynasties claiming descent from the god Frey. In this country we see the royal houses claiming descent from Woden. Now, well after the conversion, we see Woden listed as being an ancestor of the royal families. Certainly when the Romans speak of him, and of course we are going right back now, centuries before the migration period, they make no mention of the fact that these tribes considered Woden, or as they called him, Mercury, to be their ancestor. Now, it's not like this didn't happen, because around that time, and Caesar would have known this when he wrote his Bello Gallico, the Thracian princes, they actually worshipped Hermes, and as well as worshipping him, they considered him to be their ancestor. So it was going on around that time, but Caesar doesn't mention it. So we can possibly assume that the Germanic tribes on the continent at that time did not consider this to be the case. In the early 7th century, Woden was cited as a god that was worshipped by the Suevi tribe, but there was no mention of them being descendants of him. Now, the first time we actually see it written down that Woden was considered to be an ancestor was in the 8th century by Bede, in the work that he completed in 731. So there's loads of references to this being the case post-Christianisation, post-conversion, but some scholars believe that this could have been a heathen belief, a belief that would have been transmitted orally, that was then continued into the Christian society. Now, I believe that Woden would have been very important to the Germanic tribes that had settled in England. but that didn't really fit the mould after they had become officially Christian. So what we see is a process of euhemerism. Basically, the divine status of Woden is stripped away, and he was renegated to be nothing more than a human ancestor. Now, the Anglo Saxons actually loved this process. They did it a lot. Now, Bede would have been only too aware of the previous heathen cults of Woden prior to the Christian conversion, and he would have been only too aware of the power and the sway that Woden held over the minds and the imaginations of these Germanic peoples. And obviously he couldn't allow Woden to continue to hold such power, so basically he was degraded from divine status, from divinity, down to human ancestor. He was basically reimagined into a new Christian context in order to legitimise royal power. Now, in Anglo-Saxon times, royalty, the king's position, wasn't merely dependent on his birth. He had to earn that position, and I spoke about this in a previous video. Unlike our monarchy now, who claim that power by virtue of birth, this wasn't the case. And a Germanic king's authority and power very much depended upon his power and his strength and his ability to protect and look after his tribe. Now, if something went wrong, if crops failed, if they lost battles, then he would be held responsible and he would be removed and replaced. The sun's moving round. I'm going to move round as well. Hang on. Yeah, that's better. Sun's going down. It's actually, as I'm filming this, it's actually the Anglo-Saxon summer's day. It's the full moon, 3 full moons from the Anglo-Saxon festival of Yule. So today is considered to be the Anglo-Saxon start of summer, and it's a glorious day, now a glorious evening. It's lovely out here in the woods. Now, Bede wrote in his Historia, claiming from the first their leaders were held to be 2 brothers, Hengist and Horsa. He went on to say, they were sons of Wictils, whose father was Witter, whose father was Wector, whose father was Woden. Now, you may notice that is pure Anglo-Saxon alliteration. It is, of course, complete rubbish, but it's a means to remember, and it serves to reinforce the myth in order to legitimise the power of the rulers. The Anglo-Saxons were not too keen to completely let go of all of their pagan elements, particularly a god as powerful as Woden, and so they retain him, but in a degraded and less important context. I've just moved behind a tree, so I'm going to probably be getting darker and darker because the sun's going down quickly now, and keep being blinded by the beautiful sunset. So where was I? Yes, Bede listing Woden as an ancestor. Now, interestingly, in virtually all of the listings of ancestors that include Woden, he is listed as number 9 in the sequence. So this is obviously an element of Woden worship, the importance of the number 9, that they decided to retain in their tradition. Now, the Christian writers such as Bede and Alcuin were quite happy with using Woden in this way, and in some ways they endorsed it. They basically they supported it, so long as Woden was kept firmly in the ancestor box and not allowed to creep out and become, a powerful god again. Then they were quite happy with Woden being used in this way to legitimise power and to keep the kings in their position safe in the knowledge that they are descended from Woden. Now, despite this, we do see Woden creeping back into Anglo Saxon literature in the context of being a magician. Now, I said we were going to be talking about magic and witchcraft in this episode. Now, from the Eddas, from the Nordic sources, we know that Odin had a deep connection with magic, with Seidr, with witchcraft. Now, the Old English word cognate with Seidr is Siden. Now, in the Eddas, Odin was bound to the Vanir gods. It started off as an antagonistic relationship and then became one of cooperation. And in the Eddas, we know that Oðinn asked Freyja to teach him the arts of Seidr. Now, Seidr is a Norse form of magic and shamanism. It involves many different aspects. One of them is the high seat ritual, which you may have heard about. But what we know from the Eddas is that both Freyja and Oðinn are considered to be masters of this art. Now, during the Viking Age, this occupation was pretty much consigned to the realms of females. It really wasn't something that men did, and to do so was considered very unmanly or arga. Now, in the Eddas, Oðinn is not free of the ridicule for partaking in these activities, but he is definitely a shaman god. So it's very interesting that he crops up in Anglo-Saxon literature in the 9 Herbs charm, which is part of a rambling collection of remedies and charms and cures known as the Lacnunga. Now, it was probably compiled in the 10th or early 11th century. The name Lacnunga isn't its original name, it was given to it later. And in fact, the 9 Herbs charm is also not its original name. It was given to, that name was given to it by Skemp, who called it the Negan Werta Galdor, the 9 Herbs charm. But it is a fairly accurate description of the poem. Now it's a text which combines all sorts of different elements. There's Greek Hellenistic, there's Latin, there's Irish magic, there's Anglo Saxon or Germanic lore. Really, it's a right old jumble of different elements. But what it does do is it does show Woden in the role of healer and magician. Now, the charm features the number 3 very prominently, or multiplications of the number 3. So we have the 9 herbs, we have 3 and 30 enemies, we have Woden's 9 glory Woden's 9 glory twigs, or Wuldurtanas. We have 9 infections, we have 9 poisons, we have 9 adders, we have 6 blisters, and we have 3 cardinal directions. We do actually have 7 worlds though, which doesn't kind of fit, but you can see the number 9 is a very strong theme within this charm. And also the instruction to sing the charm 3 times over the herbs. So let's start, shall we, by just having a look at the 9 herbs that are part of the 9 herbs charm. Okay, so now let's have a look at the part of the charm where Woden is featured.
Wem kam sneakan, toslat henan, thayanam wudan, nigan wuldotanas, slok that they nadlan, that heo on nigan tofleak, there yandane, affel and ator, that heo nafla de wulda on hus bugan, villa and finula, vella mitigu toi, tha wiete je sheop wiete julecten, hale on heavenum, tha he hongade, seta on sanda, on sefton wulda, emam an idigum, elam to bota.
So within that charm, it's really interesting. I'm sorry, I'm being eaten by midges. It's really interesting that we hear a mention of the hanging god, hale on heavenum, Thati Hongadair. Now, while this is almost certainly referring to the Christian god, we do, of course, know the connections with Woden or Oðinn and hanging, Hangatir. Spoke about that in the first part, and obviously we know that he hung from the world tree in order to gain the wisdom of the runes. Now, in stanza 138 of the Havamal, Oðinn describes how he once sacrificed himself to himself in order to gain the power of the runes, and I'll just read that to you. I know that I hung on a windy tree 9 long nights, wounded with a spear dedicated to Oðinn, myself to myself, on that tree of which no man knows from where its roots run. So there are connections with Oðinn, Woden and hanging. And the Wuldortanas, what are the Wuldortanas, the glory twigs? Well, we can speculate, but the facts are we don't know. Could they be runes? We know there are poems within Norse sources that talk about the runes being used for healing. We know from Tacitus that they carved runes onto pieces of wood. So one would kind of assume Woden, glory twigs, runes, but the truth is we don't know, and all we can do is speculate. Now, we hear about the adder, or the snake, or the worm, as the Anglo Saxons called it, and how Woden smote it and made it fly into 9 parts. Now, I've got a little snake with me. It's not a real one, my little toy snake, and I'm just going to be a kid now. This is a snake. Well, let's just pretend this is a snake. Okay, so I've got my 9 glory twigs. If I cut this snake, and I'm a vegan, I don't go around cutting snakes, you'll be pleased to know, but if I cut this snake in with 9 glory twigs, what do I have? I have 10 pieces of snake. Doesn't really fit, does it? The snake is not in 9 pieces. However, if the snake is joined into a loop, and we now have 9 Wuldortanas, and we cut the snake, we end up with 9 pieces. So, what does this remind you of? To me, it reminds me of Jormungandr, the world serpent that's said to be coiled around the world. And also there are Anglo-Saxon examples of jewellery which are basically worms or snakes in this formation. So that's just something to think about. And I'd just like to say a big thank you to Sevi the snake for his appearance in this video. Bless him. Now, Woden crops, sorry, I'm still being eaten. Woods are great at this time of night, but they're also quite bitey. Anyway, where was I? Woden also crops up in Maxims 1, where we're told Woden made idols, the Almighty made glory, the mighty heavens. This is a powerful God, himself the true king, healer of souls. So here we hear Woden and a connection to idols. I'll just read that to you in Anglo Saxon. Woden werkte weos al walda, ruma roderas, that is a richer God, sylfs of Kuning, salwa hergend. So yes, we do know from other sources that Woden was considered, was connected with idols, and we know from Christian sources that one of the things they wanted to do was to get rid of the idols and replace with the true God. I have a few idols myself at home. So before I finish, I would like to talk about some of the artifacts that have been found in the UK that are clearly meant to be Woden, or we assume they are meant to be Woden. Now there have been plenty of Saxon coins, skiats, found with wonderful little faces on them that scholars consider to be Woden. I would love my mum to find one of those. Go on, Mum, find me a Woden skiat. Wouldn't that just be wonderful? But who knows how many more are buried in the ground. Now, there's also a lot of these. I'll show you. I'm wearing one at the moment. I don't know if you can see that, if it's in focus. My little Woden head. Now that example was actually found in Norfolk, but the thing is, there's loads of these found all over the place, and they're very similar design. Now, it must have been a very common symbol, and we don't really know what they were used on, but they all seem to have this headdress, and they're sometimes called the horned man, and it looks like horns, but what they actually are, they're birds, raptors or ravens. Now one idea, we obviously know from the Norse sources that Oðinn has two ravens, Hugin and Munin, thought and memory. So could this be his two ravens, thought and memory, growing out of his head? But these little things, and this one's found, did I say this one was a replica of something found in Norfolk? But they're found all over the place, and they're all very, very similar motif. Now we these birds could be ravens, they could also be eagles. We know that Oðinn has associations with eagles and sometimes took eagle form. Now I want to talk to you next about the Fingalsham buckle, which is a wonderful find. Now this buckle basically shows a naked man, naked except for a belt. He has the horned helmet, so he's known as a horned man, but he's also holding two spears. So sometimes he's known as a spear dancer, sometimes a horned man. Some people believe that this is in fact a depiction of Woden. So this, but this spear dancer is another very interesting motif that again crops up all over the place, not just in England, but in Scandinavia as well, and places that have been travelled to by the Vikings. Now, in the Nordic sources, Oðinn is said to have a mighty spear called Gungnir. So I'm just going to read to you from my Dictionary of Northern Mythology by Rudolf Simek what he says about Gungnir. Just find the page. Gungnir, where are you, Gungnir? Here we go. In Old Norse it means the swaying one. Odin's spear, which is one of his typical attributes. even Bragi in the 9th century calls Odin Gungnis Vafatha, Gungnir Shaker. So this is the weapon most associated with Woden. But don't forget, the spear was the most common weapon for an Anglo-Saxon warrior, but it's definitely a weapon associated with Woden. Now we see other really interesting artifacts. I'll put my book down. We see other really interesting artifacts which also have these spear dancers. Now this motif appears on the very famous Sutton Hoo helmet. Isn't it just beautiful? Now notice this, the heels of the spear dancers are being stabbed with spears. So what's all that about? But that also appears on the Torslanda plate, which was found in Sweden. Now the Torslanda plate, it's actually one of 4 dies that would have been used to press sheets of metal to decorate a helmet. Now the helmet with these decorations has never been found, but this wolf warrior is very interesting. Now this brings me to something that I discovered and was like really thrilled to discover. There was in Fenderate in Cambridgeshire, where I'm from, an artefact was found which is known as the Fenderate Prez, which is one of these dies used to make the impression on the thin sheets of metal to decorate things such as helmets. And it is an Ulfhedin, a wolf warrior. Now I'm actually wearing a t-shirt with it on at the moment. And I found this t-shirt, I'll show you. Isn't it cool? I love this t-shirt. That's how I discovered about this artefact. This is from the guys at Theatre of War. It's a great t-shirt, get one. But the Fenderate Prez is very interesting, and it leads me on to the last thing that I want to speak to you about today. It's getting dark now. And I want to speak to you about shape-shifting. Now, let's look at a Norse source now, the Inglinga Saga. And what it tells us is, Oðinn changed hides. His body lay then as if sleeping or dead, but he was then a bird or animal, fish or snake, and travelled in a moment to faraway lands on his errands or those of other men. Now this account again clearly shows Oðinn as a sorcerer. He has the ability to change his shape, whether that's to an eagle or to a snake, and that is just part of his catalogue of extraordinary magical skills. Now, we can see very strong links in the Germanic mind and culture between animals and man. Now, for Anglo Saxons, it was not uncommon to have the name of an animal. And if we think back to the Wofingers, you know, they got their name from Woofa, which means little wolf. You know, wolf was quite a common Anglo-Saxon name. Wolf and Eadwaker, one of my favourite Anglo-Saxon poems. You know, it was not uncommon for men, and I don't know about women, but certainly not uncommon, sorry I'm being bitten, for men to take the names of animals and to be described as such in poems. Now there are often deliberate identifications between the human warrior and an animal whose qualities that they were thought or wanted to embody. Now a very strong example of this is the Berserker. Now there are only actually 2 animals that are connected with Berserker gang, and these would most definitely be the wolf, who is without a doubt connected to Woden or Oðinn, and the bear, who also quite probably has a connection with Oðinn. Now, Ulfhedin, as per my t-shirt, means wolf coat, and Berserker means bear coat. Now, going back to the Inglinga Saga again, we hear, Odin's men went without armour, they slew men, but neither fire nor iron could touch them. That is called Berserker gang. Now, it was actually for this reason that I found my way back to the Germanic culture when I, 8 years ago now, when I began practicing shamanism. I was shown things when connecting with a spirit guide that I didn't understand, basically berserker things, and when I googled them I found it all written down. Basically he's a Norse warrior shaman, a berserker. So that's how I got dragged back into this about 8 years ago. So we don't only see, the wolf and the bear being represented. Obviously we see an awful lot of boars within the artifacts found at Sutton Hoo. Now the boar would be more associated with the Vanir cults, with the goddess Freya and the god Frey from Norse culture, but obviously that boar was still a very important motif to the Anglo Saxons as well, an extremely important motif. Now, within early sources that speak about shape-shifting, what is always required is a hide. In order to shape-shift, they need to have the hide of the animal. And this rule seemed to apply to some of the gods also. We see stories of Loki asking Freya if he can use her falcon cloak in order to shapeshift into a falcon. And certainly within all the early sources that refer to people changing their armour, their shape from a human to an animal, what is required is the hide of the animal to do it. And hamrama, a word from the Norse culture, actually means hide strong. Now what we see happening in some of the later texts is there not being an actual physical hide required, but it's a metaphysical hide. But really it's getting late, the sun's going down, and that is a story for another day. So thank you for joining me. I hope you have enjoyed this part 2 of this Anglo-Saxon, this episode about the Anglo-Saxon rune Os. And I said right at the beginning of episode 1 that this was all going to be about the great god Woden, and I think it has been. And I think really that's why this episode, I've ended up talking quite a lot in 2 episodes, because really he is such a complex and multifaceted deity that really I could probably talk for a week about him, but let's face it, nobody wants to listen to that. So I'd just like to say thank you so much to all of my subscribers. It's really great to have you here. It's really great to see the subscription numbers going up. Makes me excited. That's really great. Thank you so much. If you like this video, please give me a like. That will make it more visible. Please subscribe to the channel. Check out the Facebook page, check out my Patreon, and it's just really good that you have joined me today for me rambling about Woden. Anyway, come back next time. In the next episode I will be talking about the Anglo-Saxon rune Rad Bifon Richida, and we'll see where that goes. Right, so I'm going to go now because I am absolutely being bitten to pieces by these midges. The sun's going down, the moon will be rising soon. On Yule, I made a vow, I made a sacrifice, and I told you in my video about Yule that a sacrifice had to be worth it. So what did I do? I made a vow not to drink any alcohol until today. So I'm off to get myself a beer and enjoy it. I wish you all the very best. I wish you the blessings of the great God Woden, and I will see you next time. Take care. Ayla.